zodiac signs evolved from more primordial, stripped down sort of mapping devices of the Babylonians to the Rashis with many attributes is kind of a mysterious process. We don't really know exactly how or what sort of alchemy was going on behind the scenes. There are a few things that I wanted to bring out though. It's certainly legitimate, and especially for those who find it more tenable to use the tropical zodiac in Vedic astrology. I think actually probably one of the most compelling arguments for doing that, by the way, I don't think it's accurate at all because the Indians obviously used the sidereal, but one of the compelling, I guess, arguments which could kind of make sense historically about why they would work is because it was at the same time that they were developing the idea to pin the vernal equinox to the zodiac signs, that the zodiac signs themselves were being developed beyond just coordinate mapping devices. By the way, I also want to say that in the Babylonian texts, back in the ancient cuneiform tablets, which is where we see the 12 Rashis and the ancient, 18 portions of the Mullah pin and whatnot, there's also a lot of sort of mysticism and omen-based proclamations and attributes that we start seeing about planets and also different sections of the sky. But it didn't start to become systematized into a formal structure until we start seeing it after the 1st century. And in India, the first text that we saw proper is called the Yavana Jataka, and it's actually a Sanskrit translation from a Greek text. It was originally Greek and then translated into Sanskrit by, I'm not going to say his name, Yajujavubada or something. I'm usually good with Indian names, but this dude's name is really, I've tried to say it many times, I just can't get it right. But there's a lot of ways to look at this, and in one context, and it's sort of the way historians operate, because it's the first, I guess, developed text, or the oldest one that we have ever found, it's easy to assert that this proves that the Greeks, or the Greek influence, is what brought, that it was the Greeks that brought horoscopic astrology, or an astrological system based on the horoscope, or the 12 signs, into India. Because we see this text. And these folks, the Yavanas, were loosely translated as Greeks. And it's reasonable to assume that they were of some kind of Greek origin, simply because the text itself was Greek, translated into Sanskrit. Now, this was around the 2nd century AD or CE, however you say that. But what's very clear as a Vedic astrologer is that this was not an original text, which means this wasn't a text that is just showing something that someone just figured out. Okay, this shows a practice that had been going on for a while. At least, I mean, it would have to be probably at least a few hundred years by the time we saw the Yavana Jataka, and we always have to infer this. This is just sensible. Okay, this isn't a wild leap. That when you see a text with all of these attributes already in it, the guy didn't just make something up, okay? It was a compilation of the prevailing wisdom at that time. Once you write it down, you don't write it down until you got something to write down, right? So, a few hundred years, probably from the time of, 2nd or 3rd century BC, which was the time that the Babylonians, formally codified the 12-sign zodiac, and it got exported to Greece, and Hipparchus, the Greek astronomer, began calculating different stars, founded the precession. During this time, there really wasn't any writings even about astrology so much in the West, or in Egypt, or in India. It just kind of disappeared, like you didn't see it for a few hundred years. And so the appearance of the Yavana Jataka is compelling because there's a lot of Greek words in it that don't have Sanskrit derivatives. They're just alliterations of a Sanskrit word, like they're not interpretive. Like the word trine is actually a Greek word, trikona, which is just a way to make that sound trikona, with Sanskrit sounds. It's not like it was interpreted to like a triangle or something. And that the Sanskrit word for triangle was used. It was actually trikona, and the Sanskrit alliteration was just to actually mimic those sounds, for example. So we can see a lot of words in, I believe that's one of them, there are several. But the reason why we can understand that there was a lot of Greek influence is because of things like that. But something else that's always been puzzling, or that's always made me really question this assertion that this is the text that proves the Greeks brought the horoscopic astrology to India, is that there's so much Indian astrology in it, and things that are just Indian in nature, Indian culture, and the realization of how the astrology flowed between, not just astrology, but the technology flowed between Babylon and India at that time. Now, again, first we have to understand something, just to go back to the source and back to the foundation. The Indians used the same sidereal Babylonian portions in their astrological system. So once the signs were exported to India, at least once we saw them, like in the Yavana Jataka and in later texts, the Indians did not adapt the tropical system. And so, again, this is, first of all, the most compelling evidence we have that they were using tropical Rashis because they resisted, they were using sidereal Rashis because they resisted the tropical ones. And so, it's pretty clear that they begun their practice with sidereal portions, and these sidereal portions were just about exact as the same, or as their nakshatra portions in India. So the 12 Babylonian portions fit probably exact or almost perfectly with the 27 nakshatra portions that the Indians were already using. And in fact, it was at this time that we stopped even seeing the 28th nakshatra talked about. There used to be 28 in many ancient texts, particularly in the Yajurveda and some of the other texts. But by the time we started to see the astrological text, they no longer used the 28th. Probably because it did not accommodate the 12-sign, 27 nakshatra system that we already see. These things were put together, it wasn't accidental, it wasn't coincidental. They took those same portions of sky, because again, you have to understand, the zodiac, the sky itself is the divine matrix. And the sidereal sky, like when you look up and you see the sky, that's what the zodiac is in India. And so 12 portions and 27 portions are all together in the Vedic astrological system. So the sharing between technologies, between Babylon and India, was clear, not just in the fact that the Indians retained the sidereal Rashis with the same names, same places as the Babylonians, but there was also a lot of sharing with other technologies like the water clock and other measuring devices. Water clock was a measuring device so they could measure the year and the months and the days, and other kinds of technologies as well. Now, there's a lot of speculation about all of this. Particularly, one of the main researchers is David Pingree, and he's got a kind of uneasy relationship with a lot of Vedic scholars. David Frawley, Vamadeva, actually had a kind of ongoing debates with him for years because, you know, Pingree was kind of like a lot of people who had this sort of bias against the idea that the Indians ever really invented any of it. His bias was always like, well, it flowed from Greece into India. It flowed from Babylon into India. Like the Indians never created any of it. Even though the Indians were ahead on their technologies in several ways, particularly like in the Tatareya Brahmana, it seemed like their calendar system was much more developed. Their use of 12 portions predated the Babylonians, it seems. And even like naming, you know, even naming 12 solar months predated the Babylonians, at least it seems. And so, but this has kind of given him a sort of bad name. But, you know, aside from that, Pingree was always looking for the connection between Babylon and India. And as most historians assert, it doesn't make sense, again, that everyone else became tropical in their astrology, but the Indians did not. What makes most sense is that there was much more sharing between the Babylonians and the Indians than we see recorded. And in particular, by the time we see the Yavana Jataka, which is the first real Vedic astrology text, probably originated from the 1st century CE, but the translations were probably from the 2nd century. We see Vedic astrology already developed at a kind of primal level. Actually, there's a lot that's quite good in it, but there's a lot of strange mistakes with gunas and other things. But there's also references to the Babylonians in certain chapters and indications that this sharing had taken place. But one of the things that's unmistakable is there was a lot of sharing amongst metaphysical systems between Greece, Babylon, Egypt, India. And one of the reasons why some people who are, whose spiritual tradition lies in India, they want to think everything came from India. And they have a hard time thinking, well, this actually came from the Greeks, or this came from the Babylonians, when in fact that's just not true. And there's a whole kind of interesting, these are the kinds of things that are very interesting to speculate about, because we obviously don't know, and we also don't have anything to really trace. Because there were several hundred years where, in fact maybe even about 1,000 years, if you want to be really literal, from the time that the Babylonians codified 12 signs, in fact, which is about 500 BC, to the time of Varahamihira, who was the first real Vedic astrologer proper to really organize the Vedic astrology system again, is almost 1,000 years. That's a long time, 500 BC to 500 AD. And between those two periods, you had Hipparchus in Greece, who discovered the precession, or at least formalized it. Then a few hundred years later, again we're talking hundreds of years, in Alexandria, Ptolemy pins the vernal equinox to the existent sidereal signs that we were using to measure. And then a couple hundred years later, or about 100 years later, we see the Yavana Jataka, maybe 200 AD. And then there's several hundred years that pass before we see Varahamihira, and he writes Brihat Samhita, Brihat Jataka, Yavana Jataka. You want to see the link here where I talk about the texts in detail to get more detail on that. But I'm just trying to give you an idea of how the zodiac signs developed and how what's called horoscopic astrology actually developed from the primal nakshatra zodiac that the Indians were using, again, purely sidereal, and how they accommodated the 12 sidereal portions that were first written down in Babylon, but they almost certainly developed coincidentally with the Indians, because again, even those 12 portions, if you were to go back to the Tattariya Brahmana and the 12 portions that the Indians were using back then, sidereally, they probably were very much the same as what was being formalized in Babylon and written down. They were based on solstices and equinoxes and 12 portions. So by the time we started to see this formalized more, they were mixed with other Greek elements, and of course what we already know that the Vedic people, the Indians, were already practicing with Ayurveda and yoga and other kinds of relations with mystical, metaphysical things. So again, this is the stuff that's really fascinating to try to piece together. But again, what's not up for debate really is that they used the sidereal zodiac. We know they did. We know they knew what they were doing. And again, this is why many researchers have tried to find that exact link, because there's obviously a very deep link between the sidereal Babylonians and the sidereal Indians, whether they're precisely tracking stars with nakshatras, or in the Mula Pin, or later codifying those into 12 portions. And again, most of the ancient archaeoastronomers, or the people of the last 100 years or so that have really researched this, Pingree, Neugebauer, Rohrbacher, Dr. Robert Powell, even Cyril Fagan, have speculated as to how this happened, and exactly when the Indians started really practicing, the horoscopic astrology that we started to see kind of in this spasm of the Yavana Jataka, and then later formalized in the writings of Varahamihira. One last thing is this text, the Yavana Jataka, is interesting because the Yavanas, who were, again, it's sort of overstated that they were the Greeks. That's a simple way to say it, the Greeks, which is not incorrect because, it was a Greek text translated into Sanskrit. sometimes I think they're given more credit than they deserve, simply not because just of my opinion, but their statements that Varahamihira says that the Yavanas should be praised and they should be revered for the way they practiced our astrology. He says it like this. He doesn't say they created their astrology. He says for their practice of our astrology. And then in another section, this is in Brihat Samhita, then another section of Brihat Samhita, though, he goes on to say, it's quite an insult. He says the Yavanas are of low caste, and basically like they're barbarians. This is kind of the word you would use. They are like barbarians, and what would happen if our Vedic astrology just fell into the hands of those people and was not carried on in the tradition of the Brahmins? So he was a Brahmin, and he was basically saying, we need to restore Vedic astrology to its Brahmanic, and as a practice that the Brahmins bring forth, and not just keep it as something that these barbarians learned how to do. Again, it's interesting, because first he says they should be greatly respected for their love and application and mastery of our astrological system. A clear reference that, at least according to Varahamihira, there was a tradition of Indian astrology that the Yavanas were practicing. And, but we can't have our whole system be practiced by these barbarians. It's basically something like, what would the world come to if our astrology was just being practiced by these barbarians and not us Brahmins? Again, this is the kind of Indian snobbery, you might say a little bit, but it basically means to, the Brahmin was the ones who were really learned in the sastras and understood all of the, and then he goes on to say what a good astrologer is, who can calculate and do this and pure and all of this stuff. So then you get into all this stuff about what a great Brahmin astrologer is, after saying, thank you guys, but you're kind of barbarians, and this is, we're kind of reclaiming it. So this is sort of what Varahamihira's writings were about, and I just thought I would make this video to sort of explain the migration of how the zodiac became these 12 30-degree portions of sky that we now see, that were pretty much right in alignment with the Indian nakshatra zodiac, and how it went from that to the developed like rashis that we see and that we started to see and that started to be utilized.